Okay, so I got asked to talk about wellbeing and resilience and links to supporting ecological health of country. So I have used the term walking with country there in honour of what we're talking about today with the forum. All right, so this means I will be using buzzwords. How many of you are sick of the word wellbeing? Resilience? They're being used a lot. They're not always being used well. I have definitions on this slide that I won't talk through in detail, but broadly speaking, when I'm talking about wellbeing, I'm talking about people having a good quality of life. When I talk resilience, talking about people and communities being able to prepare, respond, recover, and adapt to challenges. Now, a lot of the ways I'm talking about it come very much from the Western perspective, where human health and wellbeing has been separated from country. And that's because most of the work I do is with people from Western cultures and Western backgrounds who are very much struggling to overcome that perspective. So we're all talking about wellbeing and resilience, and we're often hearing that it's really important to connect wellbeing and spending time in nature is good for our well-being, but we need to critically reflect on some of the rhetoric, because as much as it is true that spending time in nature can be good for your well-being, that doesn't always mean that people spending time in nature are caring for country in return. So I'm going to talk a bit today about spirals, and I'm drawing on a thing called Hobsbawm's conservation of resources theory, which says that sometimes the relationship between well-being, resilience and ecological health is this positive spiral where each one supports the other. That's what we want. But sometimes it can be a negative spiral. Sometimes we do things to support short-term human well-being that have profoundly negative consequences for ecological health and for long-term resilience. So it's not as simple as they all three all work together nicely all the time. We've unfortunately done a pretty good job of disconnecting those things a lot of the time. This is your eyesight test for today. You're not expected to be able to read it. This is a very old image. It's from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in like 2005, so 20 years ago. And it just basically tried to say, what are all the ways that human well-being depends on ecosystem services? And the size of the brown arrows indicates the strength of the relationship. And the key thing I want to point out here is that things like climate regulation, flood regulation, providing food, water, food and wood and fibre are the things that have the biggest arrows. They're the ones we notice most. And when we're feeling a bit of struggle, they're often the ones where we say, well, in the short term, we need this for our well-being. So it's okay to change how we're managing the environment to supply that. So what I'm going to do is present some data from a few different pieces of work that our team's been doing at the University of Canberra that start to look at that idea of positive and negative spirals and where do we need to intervene. So I'm going to be presenting data from the Basin Community Values Project. That's where we identified the ways people are valuing water and water catchments across the basin. You're going to be able to access a copy of these slides later, and it has links to where you can access the frighteningly long report from this project. I'm going to be drawing on data from our annual regional wellbeing survey. Again, there's a website, there's lots of ability to download the data I'm talking about. I'm going to be using data from the Living Well and the ACT Region survey, where since 2019 we've been surveying people living in Canberra and in Queanbeyan and in Yass about their wellbeing, their resilience and the things that are affecting it. And I'm going to draw on the Living Well and the ACT with a Changing Climate survey, which is aiming to look at how well are people positioned to be resilient to the effects of climate change in the Canberra region. So let's set the context. When we look at the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment, the large majority of humans living in it, and I'm a social science researcher, so I talk a lot about humans. We're looking at Canberra growing from 486,000 people this year to an expected 800,000 in 2065. We're expecting significant population growth in Queanbeyan and Pallarang, and we are seeing some population growth in other parts of the catchment as well. That's a lot of extra humans in our catchment in a fairly short space of time. And we need to be thinking about what the implications of that are for catchment health and how we manage the catchment. So when we think about that, we've got population growth. We also have more extreme events expected as climate change intensifies. We have multiple pressures on water demand, and we also have a lot of social and economic change. So at the moment, we've got a lot of cost of living pressures, and we're seeing very rapid recreational preference changes in the local region. So let's start by talking personal well-being. Has anyone had to do a survey where it goes, how, on a scale from 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? Hands up if you've ever had to answer that one. Yeah, sorry, sometimes, a lot of the time it's my surveys. So it sounds very motherhoody, right? But it's actually a really good indicator of a lot of your life outcomes. So we know that when people have low well-being, it predicts a lot of challenging outcomes. And one of the ones people aren't aware of is that when people go from a state of good well-being to low well-being, it often affects things like their ability to get engaged in volunteering. It affects their level of willingness to support government policies that are about caring for the environment. So that's why and apart from the fact we should care about well-being, it has some pretty important direct lines of sight to what we see happening with support for environmental policy. And we have seen, there's a couple different sort of results here. One is that people living in the upper Murrumbidgee, you'll see on the left there's a big map that just shows the Murrumbidgee as a whole, and it shows a lighter blue for it. That's because people in lower parts of the Murrumbidgee actually don't always have the absolute best well-being. People in places like Condamine, Border Rivers, Gwydir have lower well-being again. So darker blue means higher average well-being on this map. But if we just took the slice of the Murrumbidgee that's in the upper Murrumbidgee, that's actually where we've got the highest well-being in the Murrumbidgee. So we do have a population with good well-being. However, in recent years, that well-being has been declining. So we've gone from about 1 in 5 people having low well-being to over 30% in 2024. Got a little bit better when mortgage interest rates got better. Remember that last year? And then we expect that it's getting worse again at the moment. Those cost of living pressures are driving a lot of that low well-being, and this is just showing low well-being over the since 2019 to 2025. So higher bars are worse. And if we look at Canberra, about 1 in 5 Canberrans were struggling financially in 2025 in their household. About just under 30% were very comfortable or prosperous. The rest were in the middle. They're doing okay, but they don't have a lot of spare. That has consequences. So this is actually showing in the blue what proportion of people volunteered in the last 12 months. And it shows it by how they rated their household financial situation. So on the very left, if you rated your household financial situation as you were very poor, 81% of people didn't volunteer, 19% did. At the other end, those who said they're prosperous, their household's doing pretty well, half are volunteering. So there's a direct relationship between cost of living pressures and volunteering that we need to be aware of. And there's also been something, I know a few people here work in some of the management of recreational areas. We've seen a massive increase in demand for low-cost recreation, often in nature areas, which basically is almost parallel or goes in line with what we're seeing as change in cost of living pressures. So we're seeing really increased demand on cheaper campgrounds, on people using recreation reserves and nature areas in a lot of parts of Australia. And that is creating some pressure for our natural environment sometimes. It's a good thing too. It helps connect people to nature, but we're not always prepared for how big that increase in demand is. So we want people to connect to nature. We want them to do it responsibly. So let's have a little bit of a look at what we see from our data. This is data from our 2023 Regional Wellbeing Survey, where we asked people about how important it was to spend time in nature and why they liked spending time in nature. And it's important to look at that to think about, are we connecting with nature, but are we doing it in ways that make us want to then give back to nature through taking care of it? So when we look across the region, if we look across Australia, 80% of people say that spending time in nature is very important to them. So most Australians think that. If you live in snowy Monero, that goes up to 88%, same with Queanbeyan, Palerang and Yass. In the ACT, it's actually a little lower. It's at 75.8%. So Canberrans aren't as big on spending time in nature. They're still pretty big, it's 75%, but it's a little bit less. How many people are spending less time in nature than they want to? Apparently everyone living in Queanbeyan. So 58.2% of people living around Queanbeyan and Yass said they would like to be spending more time in nature. Not as many in the ACT, and that reflects a couple things. One's your level of desire to spend time in nature, and the other is your ability to get out there. We asked people how important is it to spend time near waterways, and what do you want to be doing there? So here, Snowy Valleys and Snowy Monaro, sorry, they're reported together because our sample sizes are too small to separate them. They're in the red. Queanbeyan, Palorang and Yass are in the darker green. ACT is the one that's always smaller than the other bars, and it's in the blue. And New South Wales average is in the dark blue. So we've got 71.5% of people in Snowy Valleys and Snowy Monaro who want to spend a lot of time near rivers. When they're there, the things they're prioritising are recreational activities and social activities. Things like looking for wildlife, photography, creative activities were important for less people. And what you see is that it's ACT residents are a bit less important on all of those things. So they're not as strong on recreating near waterways. We also asked more generally about spending time in nature. And I'll take you to the second lot of data there first. So we've got 75% of Snowy Valleys, Snowy Monaro residents saying they want to spend time relaxing and doing recreational activities in nature. 62% of ACT people, 73.5% of Queanbeyan and Yass. There's fewer people who feel it's important to spend time teaching others about the environment, that top one. So in the ACT, less than a third of people feel it's important to spend some of their time teaching others, and that can include their children, their friends. So people aren't very switched on to the idea that those of us who like to spend time in nature also have responsibilities related to spending time in nature. And that is a concern because it means that we're doing very well at encouraging recreation in nature, but we're not doing as well in encouraging that idea of responsibility and achieving that amongst it. And there's a lot of challenges for that, particularly for Canberra. It's got the largest amount of people in the catchment. It's also got the ones that live here the least amount of time. So many people come and move into Canberra for short periods of time and then go. So, for example, some of the data we collected, it does include people who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but the majority of people who respond to our survey who identify aren't actually traditional owners of this area. They're people who've come from elsewhere and follow country elsewhere. So that's one of the reasons I don't separate out data and show views of traditional owners, in that most of the people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander who complete the survey are not traditional owners of this area, so are saying that they're responding in a different way to traditional owners of the area. So this does raise a lot of questions for us. How do we actually breach that gap, or how do we view the opportunity? We've got an opportunity with a population that loves spending time in nature. How do we get that to actually translate into caring for country and being responsible? We then need to think about how we do that in a context where we've got climatic variability and climate change. So interestingly, in the Murrumbidgee, a lot of the population feel pretty confident in their future water resource availability. I'm not sure I would agree with their level of confidence. And this is one of the challenges when you run surveys like I do. You ask people questions and you get them coming back saying, there's nothing to see here, there's no problem. And that's unfortunately what we see. So we don't have a level of awareness of some of the challenges that climate change is likely to present for future water resource availability amongst a lot of the people living in this region. They are a little bit more worried that if water inflows decline over time, they might not have a good quality of life. But even then, most people in this particular region, when we asked that question, said, I don't know, because they're not thinking about this. This isn't on their radar. So that's probably the key thing we found on that front. It's not on their radar, and thinking about particularly water availability, ecological health and climate change is not high on the radar of a lot of people living in this region. We did have one survey where we asked, how willing are you to use recycled water? I'm just showing this one as one which sort of highlights that there's not always a strong level of thought that's gone into thinking about this. So when we asked, this is Canberrans, it's about 2 years ago, Living Well in the ACT region survey. We asked them, would you be willing to use recycled water for a number of purposes? And we defined recycled water for them. We said recycled water means water that's been used by households, that's been treated and then has been put back into your water supply. And 94% are happy to water the garden, 93% are happy to flush their toilet, 88% are happy to wash the car, 80% are happy to clean things, 75% are happy to water the garden, including for things that are eaten raw, but only 30% are willing to brush their teeth with it. So the way we think about water and what's safe doesn't always track with scientific evidence about what's safe, I guess, is the key thing. And if we get to a point with responding to climate change where we do want to use recycled water, we're going to have to do a lot to address some of these perceptions and immediate reactions that people have to the thought of using recycled water, where it's just not always quite consistent with what you'd think. The other thing on climate change views and support for action. Okay, it's not just important to have people who are willing to take action themselves. A lot of what we ask our residents to do is to support government policy and action. And so a lot of the work that my group does looks at social licence for environmental action by governments. And one of the things we've been seeing in the ACT is that we're often talked about as Canberra's a place where everybody supports action on climate change, and to some degree that is true. So this is showing how many people are really strongly supportive of the ACT government specifically taking action to address climate change, and 46% in 2023 really strongly supported taking strong action on climate change. 44% were moderately supportive. But at the left-hand side, if you can see those two tiny little bars on the graph, back in 2018, we only had 4% of Canberrans who were not very aware of climate change and didn't think it was really real and didn't really feel we should do anything about it. That's actually increased to 10%. And we're seeing growing polarisation of views. If you're seeing it in Canberra, Canberra's a place where you see the least of it for this. It's a lot more everywhere else. And this is a worldwide trend we're seeing where there is increasing diversion of views, more disagreement, more conflict about whether and how we respond to climate change, and more broadly to a lot of environmental management challenges as well. So we need to be thinking really smartly about how do we manage that? How do we respond to that? Because we're seeing it happen and it's making it harder to get support for action. Okay, this is my final slide. Terry will be happy. So how do we build positive gain spirals where human wellbeing, resilience and ecosystem health all work together to reinforce each other? And how do we avoid those lost spirals where we feel under stress and so we're kind of willing to do a bit of harm to the environment to try to prop up human wellbeing? And I'm being blunt here, but that is the reality of how that often works. First is we need to recognise risks and challenges. Where are we going to be seeing pressures to prioritise human wellbeing at the expense of ecological health? And there we need to look at growing population, impacts of climate change, but also the economic crises that are affecting people at the moment. And second, we need to think about building nature connection, which we're going to be hearing more about in the next talk. But there is growing evidence that conservation action is more strongly linked to your nature connection than your level of receipt of education and information. So we need to think about how we build that nature connection. Thank you very much.